All right, buckle up, movie lovers, because today we're diving headfirst into the cinematic equivalent of a dumpster fire. You know that feeling when a movie is so bad it's almost art? Well, our esteemed critic Charles Champlin saw these films before they became cult classics or ironic memes. He just saw them as, well, bad. And when Charles Champlin called a film unbearable, you knew it wasn't just a tough review. It was a warning. In this countdown, we're unearthing the top 15 worst films Champlain ever reviewed. Get ready for some cringe, some laughter, and maybe a few "what were they thinking" moments. Let's do this.
Yes, that's a real title, and it's just as absurd as it sounds. Santa Claus Conquers the Martians was intended as a children's sci-fi holiday romp. Instead, it became a prime example of what Charles Champlin called cinematic babysitting at its worst, brainless, tasteless, and charmless. Shot on a shoestring budget, it tells the story of Martians kidnapping Santa Claus to bring cheer to their joyless planet. The result? A film so poorly made, it became infamous. The sets look like cardboard boxes sprayed with green paint, the Martian costumes feature vacuum tubes glued to helmets, and the acting is stiff even by grade school play standards. Champlin scoffed at the film's tone, saying it seems to have been written by someone who's never met a child or a Martian. What's worse is how dead serious the film takes itself. There's no irony, no self-awareness, just painfully earnest nonsense. The production was rushed in under 2 weeks in an abandoned airplane hangar in Long Island. The actors had barely rehearsed. One of the few recognizable faces is a young Pia Zadora who went on to win, or infamously buy, a Golden Globe. Champlin noted her early presence with wry commentary, calling it the lone spark in a black hole of creativity. Incredibly, this film became a late-night cult classic, especially after being mocked by Mystery Science Theater 3000. But Champlin saw no redemption. He believed its legacy was a fluke, not a triumph. He wrote, "It doesn't deserve ironic praise, it deserves to be buried in a snowbank." For Champlin, the crime wasn't just the lack of budget, it was the lack of imagination. A holiday film without heart. To him, that was unforgivable. And that, my friends, is why Santa Claus Conquers the Martians reigns supreme on Charles Champlin's list of cinematic abominations.
Oh, Battlefield Earth, a passion project gone terribly, terribly wrong. This was based on L. Ron Hubbard's sci-fi epic and produced by one of Scientology's most high-profile followers, John Travolta. Champlain viewed the film as a 2-hour Scientology sales pitch smothered in slime and green filters. Set in the year 3000, Earth has been conquered by a race of dreadlocked aliens called Cyclos. But even that wild premise couldn't prepare audiences for what followed. Travolta, buried under rubber prosthetics and platform boots, hams it up as Turl, an alien security chief with the personality of a snickering cartoon villain. The film's cinematography is infamous for its constant use of Dutch angles. Nearly every shot is tilted, making the audience feel seasick. Champlain wittily called it a film so crooked even the camera couldn't stand upright. The production suffered from infighting, lawsuits, and bad weather. The special effects looked outdated even by 1995 standards, let alone 2000. Champlain noted the irony, a film about advanced technology that can't render a believable explosion. The script is equally bad, featuring laughable dialogue like "leverage your learning" and "man-animals" as a description for humans. It was a disaster in every department: script, performance, design, editing. The film won 8 Golden Raspberry Awards, including Worst Picture, Worst Actor, and Worst Director. Champlain was especially disturbed by the movie's ideological undertones. While the film never explicitly mentioned Scientology, Champlain argued that its glorification of rebellion through self-help philosophy was narratively thin but philosophically loaded. To him, Battlefield Earth was more than a flop. It was a con wrapped in sci-fi tropes.
Ah, Manos, the hands of fate. It began as a dare. Literally. Insurance and fertilizer salesman Harold P. Warren claimed he could make a feature-length film despite having no experience. The result? Manos, the hands of fate. A film so astonishingly bad that Champlain reportedly refused to finish his screening copy.
He later called it a film forged in the fires of incompetence and cooled in the waters of pure agony. Shot in El Paso, Texas, using a hand-cranked camera that could only shoot 30 seconds at a time, the production was doomed from the start. Dialogue was dubbed after the fact, badly. Lighting was nearly non-existent. One scene was shot entirely out of focus, and they left it in. Champlin described it as a film so visually offensive it makes public access TV look like Kubrick. The story is a mess. A family on vacation stumbles upon a lodge run by a polygamist cult leader called the Master and his servant Torgo, played by a local theater actor with leg braces stuffed under his pants to simulate goat legs. Champlin famously said that Torgo walks like his knees are filled with pudding and regret. The pacing is glacial, the plot incoherent, and the soundtrack sounds like elevator jazz scored during a panic attack. But what truly sets Manos apart, according to Champlin, is its sincerity. It's clear that everyone involved was trying their best, which only makes the failure more painful. The film faded into obscurity until Mystery Science Theater 3000 resurrected it, but Champlin warned that it should stay buried. He concluded his review by saying, "Watching Manos is like falling down a well. At first you laugh, then you scream."
Oh, The Apple, a disco-infused musical sci-fi horror masquerading as a morality tale. It was meant to be the next Rocky Horror Picture Show. Instead, it became a glitter-bombed catastrophe. Charles Champlin described it as a loud, shrill, tuneless apocalypse of taste, and audiences wholeheartedly agreed. Set in the futuristic year 1994, it follows a naive couple sucked into the corrupt world of music fame and devilish contracts. Yes, literal Satanism in spandex. What makes it worse is how seriously it takes itself. The music is grating, the choreography unintentionally comedic, and the sets look like leftovers from a kid's birthday rave. Producer Menahem Golan truly believed he was creating an era-defining masterpiece. Champlin, however, called it a visually toxic assault. During its premiere, audiences reportedly threw their complimentary vinyl records at the screen and fled halfway through. Despite its attempts at satire, the film is tone-deaf to its own absurdity. Characters burst into song with no warning or emotional buildup, and the storyline veers into biblical allegory so clumsily, it's hard to tell if it's parody or pure pretentiousness. Champlin was especially brutal about its moralizing tone, comparing it to a Sunday school lesson hosted by Studio 54. Ultimately, The Apple was too weird to be loved and too bad to be ironic. It disappeared quickly from theaters, only to reemerge years later as a cult curiosity. But make no mistake, Charles Champlin didn't see the fun. To him, this was a neon nightmare. If you've never seen it, proceed with caution and earplugs. Imagine spending over $30 million on a war epic only to create one of the most boring, tone-deaf, and misguided films of all time? That, my friends, is Inchon, a film backed by the controversial Unification Church and produced by religious leader Sun Myung Moon. It aimed to glorify General Douglas MacArthur, but to Charles Champlin, it was a disaster of propagandistic proportions, more sermon than cinema. Laurence Olivier, yes, the Laurence Olivier, plays MacArthur decked out in sunglasses and chewing a Concord pipe as if he's in a bad parody. Champlin lamented Olivier's involvement, calling it a career low point for a knight of the stage. The script feels like it was translated from broken English into cliché-riddled melodrama, then slapped together without context. The battle scenes are muddy and incoherent. There's no emotional arc, just stilted speeches about destiny and divine will. Champlin was particularly offended by the manipulation behind the film. Moon's involvement gave it a cultish, self-serving flavor that critics found repellent. Even the Pentagon distanced itself. Critics across the board panned it, but Champlin's review tore through its patriotic posturing with surgical precision. The film was pulled from circulation almost immediately. Despite its massive budget, it flopped to the box office and remains nearly impossible to find today, except in bootleg collections of cinema's most infamous flops. Champlin saw Inchon not only as a cinematic failure, but as a warning about ideology overtaking artistry. In his eyes, Inchon wasn't just a bad film, it was propaganda with a Hollywood budget.
Oh, it's Pat.
Based on one joke Saturday Night Live character, It's Pat was never meant to carry a full-length feature, but somehow it did. And Charles Champlin hated every minute of it. He described it as an exercise in discomfort, not comedy, and audiences seemed to agree. The movie grossed less than $61,000 despite a wide release. The film follows Pat, an ambiguously gendered character, as they navigate awkward social situations. The problem? There's no story, just a string of humiliating interactions and stale gags. Champlin criticized it for being mean-spirited, turning Pat's identity into a punchline rather than a person. What might have been edgy in a 5-minute skit becomes unbearable at 77 minutes. The jokes repeat endlessly. People want to know Pat's gender. Pat gets flustered and chaos ensues. But there's no growth, no arc, and worst of all, no soul. Even worse, the script treats the central ambiguity as something grotesque or alien. Champlin noted that instead of subverting stereotypes, the film reinforces them in the most tasteless ways possible. It's Pat vanished almost immediately after its release. Even Julia Sweeney, who played the character, later admitted regret. Champlin's review framed it not just as a bad movie, but as a cautionary tale about stretching thin characters beyond their limits. In short, some sketches should stay on late-night TV.
Glitter was supposed to be Mariah Carey's big screen breakout, a vulnerable star navigating fame, heartbreak, and stardom. Instead, it became a critical punching bag and a personal low point for Carey. Charles Champlin described Glitter as a film so devoid of authenticity, it feels like watching someone drown in slow motion, glamorous on the surface, tragic underneath. The film tells a story of Billy Frank, an aspiring singer with a painful past and a golden voice, but what should have been a compelling rise from the ashes tale turned into an awkward, cliché-filled mess. Carey, struggling at the time with exhaustion and personal turmoil, gave a performance Champlin described as catatonic. He sympathized with her vulnerability, but didn't excuse the film's lifeless writing and direction. Behind the scenes, the situation was worse. Released just 10 days after September 11th, Glitter arrived at a time when no one wanted escapist pop drama. Carey had also suffered a very public breakdown shortly before the premiere. Champlin noted how these elements turned the film into an unintentional tragedy, both a professional failure and a personal implosion. The film grossed just over $5 million on a $22 million budget. Despite the backlash, Glitter later gained a following among fans who saw it as a misunderstood gem. Champlin, however, remained unmoved. He believed the film's failure wasn't due to timing or backlash, it was about substance. A star can rise again, he wrote, but the camera never lies. In his view, Glitter was not just a misstep, it was a raw and painful cry for help packaged in rhinestones.
Based on a Jacqueline Suzanne novel, The Lonely Lady follows Jerry Lee Randall, played by Pia Zadora, a young screenwriter struggling to survive Hollywood's male-dominated world. But instead of delivering a bold feminist drama, it became what Charles Champlin called an exploitation film masquerading as empowerment. From its wooden dialogue to its melodramatic sex scenes, The Lonely Lady was a disaster from script to screen. Zadora had just won a dubious Golden Globe for New Star of the Year, a win critics widely believed was bought by her wealthy husband. That cloud of controversy followed her into The Lonely Lady, and Champlin didn't hold back. He called her performance blank, robotic, and deeply miscast. She recites lines about creativity and dignity, but the film surrounds her with degrading scenes of sexual assault, humiliation, and cartoonish industry sleaze. The film's direction is laughably earnest, turning every dramatic beat into a soap opera meltdown. Champlin remarked that it confuses shouting with acting and nudity with courage. Even Zadora's climactic monologue, meant to be her moment of triumph, is drenched in cringe-worthy dialogue and slow zooms. By the time she storms out of the studio, the audience isn't cheering, they're groaning. The Lonely Lady won 6 Razzies, including Worst Picture, Worst Actress, and Worst Screenplay. But Champlin's review cut deeper. He saw it not just as a bad film, but as a symbol of how Hollywood claims to tell women's stories while reducing them to nothing but ornaments and victims. To him, The Lonely Lady wasn't merely bad, it was insulting. How do you ruin Dana Carvey?
a comedian with 1,000 voices and boundless energy. The Master of Disguise managed to do exactly that. Released at the height of his post-SNL stardom, this was supposed to be Carvey's big comeback. Instead, Charles Champlin described it as the cinematic equivalent of a whoopee cushion, loud, flat, and embarrassing for everyone involved. The film follows Pistachio Disguisey, a bumbling man from a long line of masters of disguise. His mission? Rescue his kidnapped parents by transforming into a series of absurd characters. On paper, this could have worked, but what hit the screen was a chaotic mess of fart jokes, unfunny impressions, and painful pacing. Champlain noted, each joke dies a little more slowly than the last, until the film itself feels like a hostage. Behind the scenes, things were equally bizarre. One notorious rumor claims the infamous Turtle Club scene was shot on the day of the September 11th attacks, a detail Carvey later acknowledged, though with some sensitivity. But Champlain wasn't focused on trivia. He was focused on failure. He believed Carvey had been betrayed by bad writing, worse direction, and a studio that mistook silliness for childlike joy. The film runs a mere 65 minutes before credits, with almost 15 minutes of bloopers. Champlain dryly wrote, "When your best material is in the outtakes, you've already lost." To him, the tragedy of The Master of Disguise was its waste of talent. Dana Carvey's gift was reduced to babbling in costumes. For him, that was the ultimate sin, turning a virtuoso into a clown.
Oh, Catwoman. It had everything going for it. An Oscar-winning actress, a major studio budget, and the legacy of one of DC's most iconic anti-heroines. But Catwoman, starring Halle Berry, failed on every single level. Charles Champlin called it a film that doesn't just trip over its heels, it claws its way to irrelevance with all the subtlety of a collapsing chandelier. Berry plays Patience Phillips, a meek graphic designer who is killed and then resurrected by magical Egyptian cats, transforming her into a whip-wielding vigilante. Sounds wild, right? It is, but not in a good way. The CGI is appalling, with Barry leaping across rooftops like a PlayStation 2 cutscene. Champlin compared it to watching a fashion ad directed by someone who hates superheroes, actors, and audiences. The film's tone is its greatest enemy. One moment it's camp, the next it's deadly serious. The dialogue is riddled with clunky exposition, and the plot revolves around a toxic beauty cream. Yes, you read that right. Champlin criticized the screenplay as proof that you can write 110 pages and say absolutely nothing. The villain, played by Sharon Stone, is barely developed, and even she seems bored. To Barry's credit, she embraced the failure. She even showed up to the Razzies in person to accept her award for Worst Actress, poking fun at herself while holding her Oscar. Champlin applauded her grace, but not the film. In his words, some careers survive disasters. Catwoman was not just a misfire, it was a scratch across the genre's reputation. A film about power, ruined by powerless storytelling.
What do you get when you cross a rapping genie, a misunderstood child, and a plot written in what seems like crayon? You get Kazam. In a performance that made critics wince, NBA superstar Shaquille O'Neal plays the titular genie who emerges from a boombox to grant a boy 3 wishes. Charles Champlin lambasted the film as a neon-lit lesson in how not to stretch a one-joke premise into 90 torturous minutes. Everything about Kazam feels off. The jokes are juvenile, the pacing's erratic, and the dialogue sounds like it was pulled from a rejected episode of Saved by the Bell. Champlin zeroed in on the film's tonal confusion. It wants to be hip-hop Aladdin, a buddy comedy, and a social drama, but ends up being none of them. Even children found the plot tedious, while adults squirmed through Shaq's wooden line deliveries. Behind the scenes, the movie was a product of studio desperation. Disney had the rights to a Shazam movie starring Sinbad, but TriStar rushed Kazam into production first, banking on Shaq's celebrity. But Champlin pointed out, being famous does not mean you can act, and being tall does not make you magical. The result? A film that tries so hard to be cool, it combusts. Shaquille O'Neal himself later disowned the project, calling it one of his biggest regrets. For Champlin, Kazam represented the worst kind of studio decision-making, one that puts branding before storytelling. They summoned a genie, but what they got was a curse.
Few films scream vanity project louder than Redline. This was a car racing action flick funded by a wealthy producer who truly believed fast cars and faster women would equal blockbuster success. Charles Champlin, ever the pragmatist, saw Redline as an automotive graveyard of dialogue, plot, and taste, a film where the engines roared louder than any human emotion. The plot, if you can even call it that, follows underground racers competing for millions while mobsters place bets. The lead actress, Nadia Bjorlin, was a soap star with little big screen experience. Her love interest, played by Nathan Phillips, delivered his lines so stiffly that Champlain said he delivers lines as if they were written on cue cards duct-taped to a speeding Lamborghini. What makes Redline especially infamous is the real-life tragedy behind it. The film's main financier, Daniel Sadek, used his own collection of exotic cars, Ferraris, Porsches, and even a $1.5 million Enzo Ferrari. One of those cars, the Enzo, was destroyed during filming. Champlain noted this irony bitterly. More money was spent wrecking cars than hiring writers. Adding to the fiasco, Sadek later faced bankruptcy and legal trouble after the 2008 financial crash. But it wasn't just the excess that angered Champlain, it was the emptiness. The film tries to imitate Fast and Furious, but ends up as a soulless clone. The soundtrack is thumping, the editing is dizzying, and yet nothing connects. Watching Redline, Champlain wrote, is like sitting inside a blender filled with car parts and cliches. He called it a wreck on arrival.
Okay, so a shark, a great white shark. It follows a family across the entire ocean to the Bahamas to settle a personal grudge. If you're watching that, you're either witnessing a surreal parody or you're watching Jaws: The Revenge. Charles Champlin famously called the sequel the cinematic equivalent of flogging a dead fish, a movie so desperate it dragged down the reputation of one of Hollywood's greatest thrillers. The plot centers on Ellen Brody, widow of the original Jaws hero, convinced that a great white shark is targeting her family out of revenge. Never mind that sharks don't think that way. Champlin highlighted the absurdity. This isn't horror. It's marine soap opera masquerading as menace. The shark somehow travels thousands of miles, swims upright, and even roars. Yes, it roars. What makes this even worse is that it starred respected actors like Michael Caine, who famously skipped accepting his Oscar to finish filming this masterpiece. When asked about the film later, he said, "I have never seen it, but by all accounts it is terrible. However, I have seen the house it built, and it is terrific." Champlin echoed the sentiment, but lamented that such talent was wasted on a sequel that should have been sunk before it floated. The shark itself looks laughably fake, rigid, mechanical, and far from terrifying. In one scene, it jumps out of the water and impales itself on a boat. Champlin remarked, "At that point, the only thing scary is that someone signed off on the script." To him, Jaws: The Revenge was not just a bad sequel, it was an insult to a masterpiece.
Ah, The Room. Now, this one has achieved legendary status as the king of cult cinema. But before the memes, before the midnight screenings with plastic spoons flying, Charles Champlain saw it for what it was, an unwatchable train wreck. He wrote, and I quote, "It's a masterclass in wrong decisions, from writing and acting to editing and human behavior." Written, directed, and starring the enigmatic Tommy Wiseau, the film is infamous for its bizarre dialogue, emotional inconsistencies, and utterly surreal tone. The plot, supposedly, centers on Johnny, a man betrayed by his fiancée and best friend. But none of the characters behave like actual human beings. They wander in and out of scenes randomly, and unresolved subplots littered the script like forgotten grocery items. Champlain brilliantly described it as an alien's attempt to imitate human drama, based on soap operas and bad dreams. The production was just as chaotic. Wiseau reportedly spent $6 million of his own money, bought filming equipment instead of renting, and insisted on shooting in both digital and 35mm simultaneously. Actors were replaced mid-shoot, entire lines were redubbed badly in post-production. Champlain famously wrote, "You don't watch The Room, you survive it." Yet he did find something oddly poignant about it. He noted that Wiseau's vulnerability bleeds through the madness, saying, "He tried to tell a love story. What he made was a cinematic cry for help." While it later gained affection for its unintentional hilarity, Champlain always viewed it as tragic,
a monument to loneliness and ambition colliding in the dark. So imagine Who Framed Roger Rabbit, but then imagine it had too much caffeine, listened to terrible music, and decided to go on a confusing R-rated bender. That, my friends, is Cool World. Charles Champlin didn't just call it a mess, he called it a fever dream with a hangover. It's an animated, live-action hybrid where a cartoonist, played by Gabriel Byrne, enters a surreal animated world. Naturally, he falls for a sultry cartoon femme fatale named Hollywood, voiced by Kim Basinger. Brad Pitt is also there, looking utterly confused, as he often did in the early 90s. The animation is absolutely frantic, clashing violently with the live-action footage. Characters just yell for no reason, the pacing lurches, and the visuals are so chaotic they border on sensory assault. Champlin really hammered its tonal confusion, saying it wants to be noir, erotic, funny, and psychological all at once, but ends up being none. The original script was darker, more adult, but producers, bless their hearts, forced rewrites to make it PG-13. Ralph Bakshi, the director, actually disowned the final cut. Champlin believed the studio interference turned a daring experiment into a broken product. He famously quipped, "A cartoon for adults doesn't mean it should be childish." Despite a strong cast, it tanked. Audiences were confused, critics baffled. Champlin's final word, cool world, a world without rules, logic, or restraint, and no cool to speak of. Yeah, no cool at all.
So there you have it, the absolute worst of the worst according to a man who truly understood cinema. It just goes to show, sometimes, even with the best intentions or the most money, Hollywood can produce something truly memorable for the wrong reasons. What do you think? Have you seen any of these masterpieces? And what's the worst movie you've ever seen? Let me know.